Good afternoon, everyone. And sorry, we're starting a little bit late this afternoon for our 2040 conversations. We had a few technical issues, but we have that sorted out now. So welcome to the conversation that's on the link between climate and gender. And it's going to be a really great conversation. It's a topic that I'm particularly passionate about, having worked in international development for over 20 years, but also being involved in the film and talking about that in the film. So it's a topic very close to my heart, but we're very lucky to be joined with two amazing women who've been working on the issue even longer than me. Sarah Ireland, who's the CEO of One Girl, and Jane O'Sullivan, who's been working on population issues. And Jane has an affiliation with UQ, but also Sustainable Population Australia. So before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on. Wherever you are in Australia, we are meeting on Aboriginal land, and acknowledge that this land has never been ceded. So I encourage everyone to find out the history of the place that you're in and to get to know the traditional owners of the land that you're meeting on. For me, that's it's Yagara and Turrbal peoples in Meanjin, or otherwise known as Brisbane. Before we start, I'd also want to do an acknowledgement to everyone who's been affected by the fires this week, particularly New South Wales and Queensland. A lot of people have lost their homes. There's actually whole communities that have been wiped out, but also there's a lot of people still fighting fires. And I have three amazing friends who are actually actively defending their homes on the front lines of those fires. And the sad thing is they're actually people who defended those forests and also are active climate activists. And it's really just come home this week what this is all about. So to everyone out there, my heart goes out to everyone, and let's hope that we can get those fires under control very soon and see some action that we need at a federal government level to turn things around. Okay, so gender and climate change. So we're going to start by having a chat with Sarah, and we're going to follow the same format, about 10-15 minutes with Sarah, then we'll flip over to Jane. So please send your questions in as we're chatting, so we can have a really fruitful conversation in the last half an hour. So we might get Jane to turn her camera and microphone off, and then we'll start with Sarah. Okay. So Sarah, thank you for joining us on a Sunday afternoon. You've got a really long history of working across a number of development issues, both international development programs, but also humanitarian programs, and focused on women's and girls' education. But can you tell us a little bit more about what One Girl does?
Sure, and thanks for having me. Before I start, I'd like to also acknowledge the lands that I'm on today, which is the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and say again, thanks for having me. It is a Sunday, so if that door behind me opens and a small child comes through, I will do my best to get her happily back out again. But yes, I am the CEO of One Girl, which is a Melbourne-based charity started by two Melburnians about 10 years ago who were just really passionate about girls' education and about gender equality. And since then, we've grown to advocating for the rights of girls everywhere. And we specifically work in Sierra Leone and Uganda, two countries in Africa, where it's incredibly difficult to be a girl because of all the barriers that stand in their way from succeeding both inside the classroom, but also outside the classroom as well, whether it's in their daily lives or jobs or whatever it is that they're trying to succeed in. So what we do is we look at all the different barriers that girls face, and that could be inside the classroom. It could be that if they're in the classroom, their teachers make them sit on the floor, or they, at the back of the classroom, they're not asked to raise their hand. They're subject to harassment or sexual abuse in the classroom as well. So we look at how we can help them overcome those barriers. We also look at overcoming the barriers outside the classroom. So do they have access to menstrual hygiene products? sanitary pads or whatever they need, just the knowledge on how to manage their health and hygiene when they have their periods. Do they know about their own rights, about their sexual rights, where they can go to access sexual and reproductive health services? And things that we don't often think about. So confidence, leadership. Have they ever been taught how to make decisions, how to stand up for themselves and contribute to community discussions? So looking at all those different barriers, and we support girls using the vehicle of education. So again, inside the classroom through the formal education system. But we also know that the formal education system isn't for everyone, and some girls don't want to be at school. Some girls aren't able to for a variety of different reasons. So supporting them in accessing technical or vocational training as well. And when I say we look at all the barriers, so even though we're supporting girls inside the classroom or in that informal or vocational training, making sure they have access to lots of other different types of information and education. So around their menstrual hygiene, around sexual reproductive health and rights. We support them in developing their confidence, developing their leadership, supporting them with that interaction that they have with other members of their community so they can start to be involved in community level discussions. But finally, we know that the girls are only one part of this, and though where our mission is to harness the power of education to drive change for girls and their communities, if they don't have that support of their communities, they're really unable to succeed. So we work very closely with the rest of the community and making sure that everybody knows why girls should be going to school. Everybody knows what a period means and how a girl needs to support herself when she has her period, about what consent is, all of those different things, so the whole community and the girl's parents can support her to succeed.
I think that's a really important point. It's not just about making sure the education services are there and you're directly supporting the girls and the teachers, but the community. My first ever official job in development was working on the tea plantations in Sri Lanka in the 90s after they'd been privatised, and the government, basically the private companies could employ women at half the wage rate than men, so they sacked all the men and domestic violence rates went up. So initially they just focused on the women and trying to educate the women on how to try and stand up to their husbands and that they had rights, but actually didn't make a difference until they really started working with the men as well and addressing some of those issues. So you do need a whole of community approach around that.
And that's where you see the long-lasting cultural shifts as well and that change. So just in the kind of the 10 years, the 8 years we've been working in some of the communities, we've seen huge shifts. So, I mean, it sounds a little bit, dads going out and buying their daughters sanitary pads, or, big things like male elders in those communities, very, very male dominated and patriarchal communities. Those male elders are now pooling money to send more girls to school. So that's really showing that long lasting change that will be there, long after one girl leaves, but it's that support that the whole community has to those girls that will then allow that to continue generation after generation.
So just to ask a really obvious question, but often we don't talk about really obvious things. Like, why is it important to educate girls? Why is gender equality important? So apart from the obvious for that particular girl, but from a societal perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's good to get everybody into school, boys and girls alike. But girls particularly, there's a lot of research that shows that educating girls is kind of globally the number one thing we can do to fight some of the really complex issues, such as poverty, climate change, which I know we'll be discussing today, overcoming, the issues that come from preventable death, illnesses, like HIV, things like that. So there's a lot of things that education encompasses, because what happens is you get a girl into school and lots of things start to change. So her health will increase because she'll have the knowledge of where to access other health providers, what she'll have more knowledge about her body if she's in the right educational environment. But not only that, her children are more likely to live past the age of 5. So her children will be healthier. She's more likely to send her children to school. So we're seeing that generational cycle as well. And there's lots of other different kind of statistics that show that for every year that a girl stays in school, her income will increase by up to 25%. And amazingly, around 90% of that is invested back into her family and into her community. So again, it's not just that individual girl, it's supporting her entire family and her entire community. And the World Bank released a report last year, which is a really interesting report. I can share the link and recommend everyone to read it. It was done in collaboration with the Malala Foundation. And they said that there are 130 million girls who are currently out of school. And if we supported those girls to get into school, the world's economy would increase by between 15 and 30 trillion dollars. And so that's how much money the world is losing every year because those girls aren't in school. They're not being able to be financially independent or get an income. They're not then contributing that money back into their communities and into their societies because these girls don't have the opportunities to become teachers, doctors, CEOs, whatever they want to be. So we're losing out on the benefit and the financial benefit globally of those girls going to school.
That's actually a bit of a controversial point, I think, though, because on the other hand, you could say that capitalism is underpinned by unpaid labour that's often done by women. So it'd be interesting to dig a bit deeper into the statistics that the World Bank is talking about, because what happens to all the subsistence agriculture that's often in the informal sector and done by women. So so that's an interesting one that goes back to some of previous conversations we've had in other webinars.
And I'll share the report as well, because it doesn't go into a lot of depth on that, but it does provide a bit more depth to what I just said. And so we can kind of unpick it a bit, but it's a really good point. But then coming back to, is that, like it's the unfair system of women not being paid. And in Uganda, one of the countries that we work in, it's got the highest youth rate in Africa and one of the highest youth unemployment rates. And when women do get a job, they're paid around 40% less than men do. And so I mentioned before some of the barriers that women face or girls face in accessing education, but those barriers don't stop then. And so once they get an education, we've got a lot of girls in our programs who, head of class, head of year, doing really well at school, and then they graduate, and then the next barrier is that there are no jobs for girls, or they live in rural communities where there aren't jobs anyway, and their role is in the household with that unpaid labour, not in an environment where they get paid in that work environment. And so when they can get it, overcoming that barrier, then they're earning less than their male counterparts do anyway. So looking at those kind of continued barriers that girls face and how education can support them to continually work to overcome them.
Yeah, great. So getting back to climate change, specifically, what is the link between educating girls and climate change? Because that was the point that Paul Hawken made in the film, that one of the best things we can do for climate change is educate girls.
Yeah, and there's a kind of a few different links, and I know Jane will talk on some of this as well, but in terms of, and I've mentioned some of the different things that we look at with girls' education, not just getting them into school and giving them that formal educational the formal schooling system, but also looking at things like incorporating reproductive rights, leadership training, and other life skills into the girls' education curricula. And so by then you're giving them this holistic education that goes outside just kind of those curricula that we often see in school. Because teaching girls about their rights, and specifically their reproductive rights, helps to improve their health and could help stabilise poverty levels and keep girls in school longer. So also looking at the high rates of child marriage and girls who either drop out of school because of they're getting married before they can graduate, and this is obviously linked to issues around poverty as well. But then what happens to a girl's body when she does have children young, but the number of children that she will have in her life as well often increases. And so if we can make sure that the education system is holistic, and by staying in school longer. So at One Girl, we support girls who are in high school, and we support girls to graduate secondary school, because this means that they acquire the knowledge and develop the skills they need to become more independent and capable people that are seen as assets to a community. So long story short, I guess, getting to the point is that it also looks at that girls who receive this secondary education are actually 6 times less likely to be married as a child. Just important to note there that there's no clear relation between primary education or graduating primary school and not and that link with child marriage. It's really important to get girls to graduate secondary school or equivalent with vocational training. So if there's some interesting studies that look at, and one of the particular ones that we've looked at before is there was a study that was across 18 sort of low income countries that found that universal secondary education can reduce fertility rates by as much as 1/3. Wow. And this has helped in part by that reduction in early marriage. And so this means then the lowering of the population growth, and thus supporting then that long-term prosperity and reduced competition for scarce resources, which is also really important in this context of climate crisis or global warming. So you're seeing kind of these links along the way, that it's not this really clear trajectory, but if we can make sure that girls have all of this kind of holistic education and this knowledge, the reduction in child marriage, that ability to, to earn an income, to have control over their own decisions and their own families, means that there will be fewer children being born. But it's really important when I say this, that it's the choice of the girl and the young woman, that it's not, you go to school, therefore you have fewer children. It's the choice that she's able to make because of all the education that she's had. And so if she chooses to have more than 2 children, more than 4 children, if she chooses to stay at home and look after the children and be responsible for the household chores, that's her choice, just as much it should be her choice to go and get a job and to have fewer children. So it's really in this non-coercive environment.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point. And it's also, I just want to highlight at this point, the same correlations that you see not just in low-income countries, but also high-income countries, including Australia, is that the longer girls and young women stay in school, that it's that delay to, and the choice around when they start having children and how many they have. So it's, I think that's also important, because sometimes debate gets hijacked around who we're talking about and which women, but it's actually across the board with that.
Absolutely. And I think can I just say it's one more little thing, that we often really focus on the population size and that link, but it's also, there's other things around girls' education and climate change that I think is really important to mention as well, looking at, for example, the skills that education and things like life skills, public speaking, critical thinking, self-confidence, that are really important to a person, any person, to respond, to problem solve and to respond to situations that often come up when people deal with any kind of crisis, but in this situation, a climate change related crisis. So it's in a lot of countries, women are increasingly playing roles as stewards and managers of the climate, of food, soil, water. And so it really highlights this need to acknowledge that across many countries, and as you said, both high and low income countries, but across many countries in the world, there really is a strong link between women and natural systems that are at the heart of the family and community life. And with education, women will be in a much better position to understand, to reevaluate when these changes happen and take action to sustain themselves, but also those who depend on them. and really look at how they can protect kind of those natural resources and adapt as farming changes and as access to water changes. So it's again looking at education in a different way, not just going into that formal schooling system.
Yeah, the other side of that too is the emerging research around, there's research for a long time around humanitarian disasters and natural disasters and having an disproportional effect on women and children as well. So there's also the impacts of climate change that come into this. And just on another note, the climate change movement wouldn't be a climate change movement without women leading it. It's actually a very female-dominated area. So that's an interesting point. I might need to flip over to Jane now, but thanks for that context. That's a really great way to start. So Jane, I might need to get you to turn on cameras and microphones.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Hello,
can
welcome.
You hear me now?
Yes, we can, and you popped up so we can see you too. So Jane, you've been working on women's rights issues for a long time, and you've seen changes, particularly in the international development area, around, particularly around population and reproductive rights. So we've talked a lot about education and some of the other issues, but often in development these days, the funding will go into education as kind of the main thing to look at. Is that enough in itself? Because there is a correlation between education and women having less children and being more economically empowered and healthier, and that being passed on to their kids. But is that enough in itself, or is there more to this that we need to be looking at?
There is so much to look at, and it's very hard to, put simplistic solutions on the issues facing girls, particularly in less developed countries. Education is obviously very important, but when 2040 is talking about the impact of empowering women on climate change, they're obviously talking about the effect on population growth. And in that case, it's very simplistic to say because educated girls have fewer children, therefore spending money on education of girls is the best way to reduce population growth. It doesn't really work that way. We have to look at cause and effect and how much we're making assumptions about education of girls being a cause and having smaller families as an effect. When Paul Hawken was talking about their work through Project Drawdown, what they actually did was compare the emissions between the United Nations medium population projection and its low population projection. They didn't actually look at what actions could be taken to achieve that difference. But they merely assigned that difference half to educating girls and half to family planning programs. So that was an arbitrary choice. It's not really an evidence-based choice. Obviously, educating girls has, every reason to be supported in its own right. But we need to be very careful about saying, well, because it's also a solution to all these other things, we don't have to address the other things directly. And certainly population growth is one of those other things that really needs to be addressed directly. And by addressing birth rates, we also advance girls' education. And the countries that have addressed birth rates through voluntary family planning programs have achieved much better empowerment of women and education of girls in the next generation than the countries that have actually done quite well at getting girls through school but haven't seen that fertility decline and consequently haven't reduced poverty to the same extent. Households with fewer children can afford to send their girls to school. Households with fewer children don't keep their girls out of school to look after younger siblings. Obviously, girls who have access to contraception themselves don't have such high problems of teen pregnancy, but then there's the whole community and cultural issues that Sarah was talking about in terms of cultures not wanting unmarried women to have access to family planning and not wanting them to learn about family planning for fear that it's going to make them promiscuous. So there's a whole of society approach that we need to take to family planning that very much requires engaging men. And I was just reading an article yesterday about women's empowerment in Pakistan and how if the first child is a boy, the woman has more decision-making power in the family because she has gained respect and status as having done her job, basically. So by giving women that tiny little bit of extra power through having sons, women are trained to devalue their own daughters. You know, it's a vicious cycle that it's actually undermining the status of women. But, you know, that's happening in Pakistan. In Kerala, which had much the same culture, addressed that 50 years ago. And that doesn't exist in Kerala anymore. When I went to Kerala and visited scientific colleagues, you know, and asked about their families, you know, say, oh, well, my daughter's now in high school, or, you know, it was just completely natural to have one child and to be very proud of her if it was an only child and that was a girl. So these things aren't set in stone, but they, you know, it's like a chemical reaction that you have to put a bit of energy in order to get over the hump, and then it runs by itself down the other side. And that's what really a lot of community engagement requires around family planning.
Yeah. So when you say dealing with it directly, what do you mean by that? What's involved in those kinds of programs? So the ones that, because there were some really successful programs in a number of countries, like you said, where they directly provided family planning support and took on, you know, lowering the population growth rate as a target nationally. So what were they doing that made that successful?
Right. Well, what they were doing first up is they were not shy about saying population growth is a problem for us. As a country, we need to reduce our population growth. Population growth is making us poor. You know, now we've got this culture where just saying that is problematic because it's immediately assumed that it's inviting coercive measures, you know, forced sterilizations and one-child policies and all of those draconian measures. But these programs didn't have any forced measures, but they did actively advocate for small families, because people in a culture where it's always been valued to have a large family, they know the problems of having too many children to support, but they need a social license to embrace a different model. And once the society started doing that, they don't go back because they appreciate the benefits, and the children from small families appreciate, you know, what they have gained by not having so many siblings. So in places like South Korea, in Thailand, Indonesia, Tunisia, Iran, Costa Rica, the Maldives, Mauritius, you know, they're all countries that had good voluntary family planning programs to a greater or lesser degree. And some other countries have had quite good ones for short periods but haven't sustained them.
Like the Philippines, where I worked, which was interesting because it's always held up as a Catholic country, therefore you can't do good reproductive health services. But actually during the 80s under Marcos, they had a very successful program, and then the international funding to that was cut in the 90s. So it was interesting working there because I had women who were saying, you can't tell me it's not a sin to have so many kids that you can't feed them. So where's the choice? Where's the support for us to actually live well in that? So I think sometimes the culture and religious stuff is used as an excuse for it, because there have been programs in countries where that culture has shifted, like you said, where there's a social license, where there's national government support, where there are services in place and women have the choice to use them legitimately and their rights are protected through law. You do see those changes, like you're saying.
Yeah, and the Philippines is a good example where girls' completion of school has been really quite high for Southeast Asia for a long time, and Malaysia also. And those countries have retained quite high fertility compared with Indonesia or Thailand, which had much lower levels of education but achieved much more in terms of birth reduction through their family planning programs. The Catholic Church is a problem. Just this week, there's been a big summit, a United Nations summit in Nairobi for the 25th anniversary of the Cairo Conference on Population and Development, which established the regime under which population development work has been done ever since. And there's a dissenting statement published by 11 countries led by USA that's really saying we don't accept the idea of reproductive health and rights because it's pro-abortion and it's, you know, cultural imperialism. And, and it's just so deflating to see those countries push back. And it's obviously an activity that was orchestrated by a Catholic, you know, a movement through the Catholic Church institutions. So yes, there are problems with religion, but religion doesn't need to be a barrier. A lot of Latin American countries have done quite well in delivering family planning.
So on the climate change front, it's interesting, it's been an eye-opening for me talking about this issue in public, and it's interesting even in Australia, the pushback. So people will say, we don't need to talk about population. Population is not really an issue. We should be talking about our consumption levels instead, or don't worry, even in Australia, we've got the technology that we can live more intensively on the land. So there's no issues with carrying capacity that we need to worry about. What's your response to those kinds of arguments?
My response is that all of those things that we could do to support more people would be better applied to supporting a smaller number of people better. You know, we're just losing the opportunity to transition to renewable energy faster, or to be less aggressive in our management of land, you know, using less chemicals because we don't have to produce quite so much food from every arable hectare. All of these things are opportunities that are undone by adding more people. Because no matter how cleanly people live and no matter how environmentally conscious they are, they must use resources and energy to just to survive. And even the least developed countries where the use of energy is very low per person, reducing births through family planning services reduces carbon emissions more at lower cost than any renewable energy technology. And that's really a sobering thought, that this thing, which should be the low-hanging fruit because it empowers women, because it saves lives, because it prevents poverty and civil unrest, and because it protects the environment and biodiversity. In addition, it's the cheapest way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and yet we're not doing it because we're too afraid that if we talk about population growth, somebody's going to shoot us down. We're spending less than 1% of international aid on family planning.
Whoa.
And we only have to double that. You know, we only have to take another 1% from the other sectors, and we'd actually achieve more food security, you know, than spending that money in agriculture. We'd achieve more girls' education than spending that extra 1% in girls' education. We'd achieve better health than spending that extra 1% in health. But we don't do it because we're bullied out of not doing it by the pushback against talking about population growth. You know, ending population growth is about protecting people. It's not about telling people how many children they have. It's about protecting them from the damage that too many people is doing to their resource base.
So where's that bullying coming from? Because I know that's been a theme in some of the big international negotiations at COPs and the Earth Summits, where that voice around population and funding reproductive health services has been silenced and tried to be pushed by a number of countries, and it's just been pushed out. So, and that the level of support in international aid has fallen. What's behind that? Or who's behind that? Like how?
Look, it's very. it's a bit speculative exactly who and how it works. I think it's sort of interesting to see how a meme can be put out there quite deliberately by people with a vested interest, and it gains a life of its own and is perpetuated by people who are quite sincere in their good intentions but are misinformed. And there are a lot of people who genuinely believe that there's no population problem and that everybody who talks about population growth is, you know, they're just using it as a cover for eugenics and trying to get rid of black people or something silly like that. When the people that I know who are passionate about extending family planning are passionate because they care about the people in high fertility countries, not because they don't want them to, you know, expand in numbers and political clout. There are all these myths that are built up about population growth being good for the economy, when you know, it's good for the big multinational capital owners who are trying to make money from other people's labour, but it's not good for the individuals who are providing that labour at all. But these myths are being pushed right now, particularly by Catholic institutions in Africa, you know, saying, oh, but we need more population growth in Africa to build the working age population because, you know, look what's happened in Europe. There's just too many old people and not enough workers, which is all complete myth. But they're the things that are being said in countries where there's maybe 2 or 3% of people are over 65 and it's completely irrelevant. And they are suffering daily from too much population growth that they can't afford to provide the extra services and infrastructure to support.
Yeah, it's and then yeah, the interesting thing is also around migration. It's like, well, if we need more people for, like in Australia, to actually fill a lot of jobs, but then we're also contradictorily against migration. So there's actually a lot of people that need a home as well. So that's a whole other discussion that we probably don't have time to get into right now.
You're a bit away from our topic today, but yeah. My take is that every country has to embrace its own population peak and decline in order to give license to other countries to do that. And, you know, for Australia to be saying, well, our economy depends on population growth, what does that do for Papua New Guinea, where population growth is its biggest problem in terms of spreading poverty and preventing them from providing services to their citizens? But all I hear from Big Sister Australia is that population growth is essential for the economy and it makes the economy stronger, which is a lie, and it's a very damaging lie for developing countries. And it takes away political will from funding family planning, which is, you know, giving women power over their own lives. I mean, leaders didn't ever do it in order to empower women. This is the problem with the sexual and reproductive health and rights agenda that the UN has adopted. Leaders don't care. In fact, they feel threatened by giving women more power. What they care about is their economy. When it was widely accepted that population growth was a threat to the economy and it needed to be reduced to strengthen the economy, they were willing to give those services to women. But they're not willing to do it for the sake of women, you know. So we have to kind of coerce them into do it. And it's not lying. It is absolutely, you know, the countries that did that have benefited enormously economically. We just have to push back on the people who are saying that's untrue and it's all about repressing people and telling them how many babies to have, because that's not what we're on about.
No, it's about actually women legitimately having a choice about how many children they have.
You know, what we have now is coercive pregnancy. You know, at least 80 million pregnancies a year are unplanned pregnancies that women didn't have the option to avoid.
Whoa, that's a lot. We're going to have to go to questions. I'm sorry, because there's more time to talk. I do need to get to the questions so that because there's some coming through. And Sarah, we might get you to put your camera and microphone back on so people can hear you. So let me have. Let me see. So let's have a look. So menstrual cycle awareness or education can teach girls and women about their fertility, i.e. family planning practices, so they can control their own fertility if they know how it all works. Sorry, that wasn't really a question. That's from Jane Collings. So I think that's a question about, I'm paraphrasing here, Jane, I'm sorry, Jane Collings. But what about just teaching women about how their bodies work as a way for them to manage their own family planning? Might throw that one to you, Jane, because that would be something you'd be.
Yeah, that's an important part of family planning is sex education. Again, it has to be in a context where there's a social license for using birth control. So I've actually been working in support of a project in Uganda that's following an integrated development model called Population Health and Environment, PHE, which works on in communities that have particular environmental management issues. And this one's about Lake Victoria and its fisheries being protected. That works on diversifying livelihoods, improving family health, issues around gender equity and reducing child marriage, and family planning as a package. And by engaging the community in developing its own image of where it wants to go in the future and how these things fit in to building a stronger future for itself, it really rapidly builds community support for family planning and smaller families. So these ways of integrating knowledge, all build on each other, and no one issue is going to get there. You know, there are plenty of women who've got good sex education who still choose to have 5 children. At some point, they need to be told that it's better for their children if they don't have so many, and it's better for their own household finances and well-being.
Cool. Another question, so from Andrew Cole, is there a similar focus on educating girls, trans men, women on menstruation in Australia, and our poorer sectors communities could use it? Yes, there's been a history of some very amazing programs like Family Planning Australia that have provide a lot of support in different communities, and they, similarly to the international cycle, correct me if I'm wrong, Jane or Sarah, but my understanding is there's been a lot of cuts to those programs and services across Australia, and particularly in Northern Australia, Northern Territory as well, to some Aboriginal communities. A lot of funding has been cut to programs for, especially around reproductive health services for girls and women. Did either of you have any clarification on that?
No, work in Australia isn't something that I focus on.
Yeah, I'm not really aware of the trends in specific programs. I do know that family planning was kind of shifted portfolios recently, kind of to protect it from conservative cutbacks in Queensland. And we've done a little bit of work with the organisation called Children by Choice in Queensland, which was brought into existence to help women with unwanted pregnancies in an environment where abortion is illegal. And it's very obvious through their long history of work that disadvantaged women are very much more exposed to unwanted pregnancy and have fewer options to deal with it. And have, it's ridiculous that the most effective contraception, which is the long-acting reversible contraceptives, the injectables or intrauterine devices, IUDs, are very expensive in Australia and often require more than one visit to a doctor. So for a lot of rural women or women who don't have a lot of control over their own finances because of partnership issues, they're just not accessible. So we've actually set up a little crowdfunding project with Children by Choice to allow people to do voluntary carbon offsetting by donating to Children by Choice specifically for long-acting contraceptives for women post-abortion, so they don't have to come back and have another one, or you know, they're saved from these unwanted pregnancies. So that's a real issue for disadvantaged women in Australia. And it doesn't have to be. The government could just easily make all sorts of contraception free, because it saves so much money in terms of the health system and in terms of the foster care system for children from those disadvantaged communities.
Cool. So another question, how do we approach the issue of sexual violence towards women leading to unplanned pregnancy? That's from Beth Ma.
I can speak a little bit to this in terms of our programs. Obviously, so one of the things that we were doing a lot of, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, we were doing a lot of teaching girls about their sexual rights, about consent, about what that meant, and then looked a little bit deeper and why girls were dropping out of school because they were falling pregnant early. In Sierra Leone, it's actually illegal for a girl when she gets pregnant to continue to go to school. And so started to dig a bit deeper, and you know, the girls who have to catch a cab to school, or you know, like a common mode of transport, they were falling pregnant because of sexual abuse or rape or whatever, you know, coercive sex, rape, on the way to school, that the teachers were perpetuating sexual abuse of girls. So all these men in their lives were coercing women, or young women, girls, into having sex and creating teenage pregnant, and you know, they were falling pregnant because of that. So what we then did is we launched a program in the communities in which we work, a pilot program looking at how to bring the entire community together. So doing training with girls, again, continuing that in that training, because it was obviously really important that girls themselves know what their rights are and where to access, as I said earlier, family planning services and things like that. But if we didn't also educate everybody else in the community on what those rights were and what consent meant, and you know, all of those following steps, then the girls only have a say up to a certain point. And if they're coerced into it, if they're forced into it, then that's, you know, they still fall pregnant. And so we had to address that problem, because in the communities in which we worked, and we were really working hard in a variety of ways to keep girls in school, if we didn't expand our programming, then we were only looking at a very specific issue. We weren't looking at all of the factors that were impacting on these girls. And so having that community approach, and not just, again, I think a lot of times we look at putting this all onto these young women, onto these girls, and saying, you need to have fewer children, you need to stop falling pregnant early. Well, that's it's two people that need to be there for a girl to fall pregnant. And so it was really, that made such a huge difference. So when we started to really expand our sexual reproductive health and rights program out into the entire community. And that's when we started to see more girls, you know, making it all the way through to the end of secondary school to be able to then, you know, graduate and make the choices on what they wanted to do next. And that was a really key thing that had a huge impact on the teenage pregnancy rates in the communities in which we piloted the program. And I think that that's what's needed. It's expanding our view and expanding our approach outside. If it, you know, we still might call it a girls' education program or a sexual reproductive health and rights program for girls, but it needs to have that entire community involvement.
Yeah, and the right and legal rights to back it up, and the systems to make that work, because yeah, it's not just an education program if the police turn a blind eye or end up, you know, blaming the girl as well, so, or the parents.
And yeah, and that's exactly right, and I didn't mention that, and it's working through those pathways. And so looking at when you know, when this does happen to a girl, when a girl is sexually abused, what are the legal pathways that are in place that aren't going to put that girl in more danger? And so it's both in those referrals and the reporting mechanisms, but also in that prevention, and having that. It's all very well if the legal framework is in place, if it's not being enforced. And so what is the specific training that needs to happen with school teachers to change that culture in the schooling environment, with the local police, with the local child services departments, or, you know, whatever it is that's in place. And so looking at those specific things to actually enforce what in many cases there are laws. It's just that enforceability and that cultural acceptance if a law is made at a national level all the way down to that community level.
Yeah, great. I think we've got time for this. Yeah, go for it, Jane.
I was just going to say that one thing that the successful family planning programs have done is work on demedicalising contraception. So you don't have to have access to a health professional in order to get it. And if even in a culture where they don't really accept unmarried girls using contraception, if you can get it from a hairdresser or a street vendor, it makes it much easier for those girls to access. So that's just one little contribution in the context where it's taking a lot longer to shift that whole cultural attitude towards girls and their protection.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, that's definitely a great point. One of the biggest barriers to the health workers in the area I worked in the Philippines getting access to reproductive health was the chief medical officer, who didn't think that women should have the right to choose how many children they had. That was the man's job in the family to determine the shape of the family. So he actually blocked any aid coming to the community to support free contraception. So yeah, the more ways women can access it, the better. A question about culture, and this might be the last one that we end on. I'd be interested in both your thoughts on this. Maybe starting with Jane, because you mentioned India, but wouldn't you also need to change the views of countries where there is a dowry for girls, so that families no longer have the financial outlay that might see girls as a burden rather than an asset? So you can talk about dowry, but there's probably other cultural issues. So that question around how do you change culture, and Jane, because you mentioned that there'd been successful programs that even where there were cultural barriers that overcame them. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it would depend very specifically on which setting you're talking about and what the cultural practices are that are having quite perhaps non-intuitive effects on people's behaviour. But I know that in a lot of places where the birth rate has been reduced, people lose interest in dowry because families are not so desperate to offload their extra daughters. And people, in a lot of these cultures, there are, for various reasons that are all unfortunate, there are fewer girls than boys, sex-selective abortions or just neglect of baby girls. So it becomes easier for girls, even if they're not born into a particularly advantaged family, to find a husband who wants to take her regardless of dowry, if there are not so many girls around and each family isn't competing for the very few boys that look like having any financial prospect, because it's just a lower competition environment where that price mechanism for making a good match starts to fall apart. People realise, I mean, everybody, even in those situations, realise it's an undesirable situation, but they're coerced into it because not engaging means a worse outcome for their family. So lowering the birth rate actually starts to erode those traditions that are really built on hyper competition in an overpopulated setting.
I hadn't thought of it that way. That's really interesting. Sarah, did you have any last thoughts, particularly on the cultural and the sort of programs you've talked about? There was also another question about, you talked about piloting things and the outcomes of that, but maybe reflecting a little bit on how what you're doing I guess, disrupts the hold that some of those cultural practices that are trying to maintain women in a particular position. Like, how have you seen a change around those cultural aspects?
Yeah, and I mentioned some earlier around male elders in the community. You know, these are some specific communities that we're working in at One Girl, but pooling money to support more girls to go to school because they've seen the impact that has had with in some of the One Girl programs, not just supporting girls to finish secondary school, but also doing that vocational training and supporting girls to get jobs, whether it's starting their own businesses or working in an established workplace. But it did, the question that you asked did make me think of a few years ago, I was working for a different organisation and I was in a drought in East Africa, and I was up in one of the northern areas of Kenya, and I was there to do an evaluation or some monitoring on a girls' education program that we had, and I was working with a lot of the girls who were currently part of the program, and we were talking about, okay, great, loads of girls were going into the program, and so we had really high numbers of girls entering school, but we had quite a lot of girls that were dropping out of school. So we didn't have that sort of completion rate. So working with the girls themselves on what were the issues and what were they facing and how could the program, the organisation I was working for, help, you know, what could we do to support girls to stay in school? And we got to a point where there was a lot of things coming up on dowries, and you know, it was a very cattle focused community in which, you know, girls, the younger they are, they were worth more cows when they get married. And so I started to shift the conversation and I started to say, okay, well, what can the program do to help with the dowry system, and what can we do to support this? And the girls themselves turned around and said, we don't need you to be in this conversation. We need you to make the schooling system encourage us and support us to stay in school until we finish. And yes, there's an issue there with the dowry system, but what they wanted me to do was have places in that school for them. They wanted to be able to have that education so they could graduate, because they believed that once they would graduate, they can then deal, and they have that education themselves, they can deal with the issue with dowries with their families themselves. And it was a real pushback and kind of and I know that's one very specific example, but it really brought back to me, and this was quite earlier on in my career, just that real value of education and the girls themselves saying, this is our fight, you stay out of that one, you just help us stay in school and you just help us get an education and we'll do the rest. And it was that real education as that launch pad for them to be able to overcome all those other barriers that they're facing in other parts of their lives. And so I think that is a cultural shift as well, and it's having the community acknowledge the real value of girls being in school, and then they can address the other things because they've got that education and they've got that level that they're suddenly speaking from with the community elders.
That is a great example to end on, because often we talk about choice, but actually choice actually comes from having the structures and systems in place that actually support people to get to a place where they actually have choice, not just knowledge, but services to back them up and the rights to back them up as well. So thank you both so much for joining us this afternoon. It's always a complex issue talking about gender, and I'm feeling better about having had this conversation, because it was important that it was in the film, that there is a link between gender and climate change, but there's so much depth to this issue that I really wanted to have the opportunity to talk about more. So thank you both for helping with that conversation.
Thanks, you,
Amanda. It was a pleasure.
And thanks everyone to joining us. If I can be a bit cheeky, I do notice that the numbers this afternoon are lower than every other webinar we've had. That's, I think, because this is such a touchy issue. So I'm going to encourage the people who have listened to share the recording and actually start some conversations about women's rights, because it's something that, as Jane said, we don't often talk about. And as soon as you start talking about, people get very emotional. And rights in this country for women are also under attack in various sectors as well. So we need to be having more of these discussions. So I hope this conversation has helped you to go and have other conversations too. We've got one more left, and it's the big one, which is how do we keep going in the face of everything that's happening with climate change? How do we look after ourselves? How do we maintain hope? How do we deal with the issues of grief and despair that come up? And how do we support each other? So that's the last conversation we'll be having in December. I don't have the specific date for you yet, I'm really sorry, but keep an eye out for the email this week where we'll be advertising so you can sign up. And thank you all for joining us. Okay, bye. And end.